My name is Huntley Hamilton, and I'm a teacher, social studies teacher at Delta High School. I'm going to be talking today. Want to remind you to take your connection card out of your bulletin and fill it out and hand that in. That's kind of the way that we connect with people and the way that you can, there's even like a free gift, I think, if it's a first time. So you might as well do that. I wanted to start today. Don set the mold last week, so I wanted to start with a joke today. And it's like, public speaking 101 is you start with a joke. And I have to say, this one is K-Love approved. I heard this on K-Love, so it's got to be good. So this minister, he'd been minister for a long time, decades of service, and well thought of, passed away, and he went to heaven. And he actually appeared, before he was in heaven, he appeared in the line to go through the pearly gates. So it's this long, long line, and it's winding up through the clouds to the pearly gates. And he notices that in front of him is a guy that appears like Middle Eastern or something like that. And he's a minister, so he strikes up a conversation with the guy and finds out the guy was a Christian and was saved and all that. And, the kind of thing goes back and forth. Well, what did you do for a living? So, the Middle Eastern guy asks the minister, well, I was a minister. I had my own church. It was great. Had a great life, and I'm just happy. And, well, what did you do for a living? And the Middle Eastern looking guy said, I was a cab driver in New York City. Wow, that must have been crazy. Oh, yeah, and he tells stories, and the line winds up, and they get close to the pearly gates, and I guess it's St. Peter, right? It's always St. Peter in the cartoons that's at the pearly gates, so it's got to be St. Peter. The Middle Eastern-looking guy says his name, and St. Peter goes through this big book. Oh, yep, you're in, and here's your, like raiment that you're going to have when in heaven. He gives him this silken robe. He gives him a crown. He gives him a golden scepter. And the cab driver goes on through. And, it's human nature. The minister's like, what am I going to get? Am I going to get something better? What's going on here? And so he goes up there. St. Peter tells his name. He goes through the book. He says, okay, you're in. Here's your raiment. We've got a terry cloth bathrobe for you. We've got a paper hat, and we have the cardboard thing that after the wrapping paper is done, that's your scepter. And he says, I'm happy to be in, but what's the deal? Why did this guy get that? He said, well, we have this merit-based system, and the deal is it's based on results. For 40 years, you had people sleeping in the aisles. For 40 years, he had people praying for their lives and talking to God in the back of his cab. So that's what's going on. So hopefully, you won't be sleeping in the pews today. And we are going to be talking about prayer. So that's how I can justify that joke, is we're going to be talking about prayer. Today, we're about halfway through the book of Jonah. We've been in it a couple weeks, and then we got today, and then we got a couple weeks more. Today, we're going to be focusing on the prayer that Jonah prayed while he was in the fish, right? And we're going to be focusing kind of on how it can be a model of prayer for us today. Prayer is such a fundamental part of our faith, right? It's such an amazing thing that at a moment's notice, in any circumstance, we can be in contact with the creator of the universe. It's mind-boggling when you really think about it. And yet we don't really talk a lot about it. We don't talk about, the building blocks of it. And that's what we're going to kind of do today. But first, we're going to go to the last verse of the first chapter of Jonah, Jonah 1:17. And we're going to go to 1:17, and I have to flip back and forth here to my reading glasses. I apologize to read this to you. So 1:17 gives us this. It says, but the Lord provided a great fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was inside the fish 3 days and 3 nights. So I know that John a couple weeks ago was like, the fish isn't the important part of it. The important part is the journey. The important part is, how, we kind of reflect Jonah. But come on, let's focus on the fish for just a couple minutes here. I want to do it. I mean, think about this. You're telling somebody the story of Jonah. They've never heard the story before. They're totally unchurched and all that. Never heard of it. Never even saw the VeggieTales one. They've never done any of that stuff. And they're like, well, what's this Jonah guy? Okay, here's the story. He was a prophet. He talked to God. God talked to him and said, we want you to go to this one city and save people. He didn't want to do it. And so he fled. He got on a boat. There was a big storm. He asked for the sailors to throw him out. Then he was swallowed by a fish for 3 days and 3 nights. And he was barfed up on the beach. And then he went and saved the city. What part of that would you think that person would want to talk more about? The fish. The fish. So the last couple weeks, guilty pleasure here, I've gone way too deep into what animal it might have been. And this kind of feeds into one of my secret interests in the world, and that's cryptozoology. Cryptozoology is the study of hidden animals. My wife is slowly sinking into her seat out of embarrassment at this point. Because if you go out and look at the back of our truck, there's a sticker on the back, and it's got the outline of Bigfoot, and it says, I believe. Oh, cryptozoology's got all the good ones. It's got Bigfoot, Loch Ness Monster, the Yeti, even some of the weird ones, the Chupacabra, the Yowie, the Yeren, Mokele Mbembe. It's got all the good ones, and I love that sort of stuff. So I'm like, okay, what kind of animal could it be? Let's go on a cryptozoological quest to see what kind of animal it could be. First school of thought is that maybe it was a one-off that God made. It was some sort of I don't know, mutant, would you say, or some sort of this is just for this task. We're making this animal. I'm making this animal, and that's how it could accomplish the fact. But there are 3 candidates for real existing animals that we know of today. You got the whale shark, you got the blue whale, and then you have the sperm whale. The whale shark is also known as the megamouth. It's huge. It could totally easily, encompass a human going into it. And same thing with the blue whale, largest animal on planet Earth, right? Maybe the largest animal that's ever existed. We don't know. But they both have some good things going for them. They both have the big mouth. They both have large stomachs. The blue whale, this is just amazing, can have a ton, 2,000 pounds of material in its stomach at any given time. So a person in there is not going to be a big deal. Here's the problem with the blue whale and the whale shark is they feed on plankton, which are these little microscopic fish. They don't have teeth. They have these kind of strainers that they suck water in and suck the plankton through. So their throats are like a foot wide. So if you know the story, you not only Jonah goes down, he comes back up. That same passage. And so Jonah may have been a little dude, but a foot? I don't know. But then we get to the sperm whale. So the sperm whale, probably my favorite candidate for the fish. Largest example ever was found in the Mediterranean Ocean, where this is all happening. They eat larger animals. They don't eat plankton, and so they have teeth, which is not so good for Jonah coming in. But that does mean that their throat is fairly wide. Also, we'll see in a second here that that Jonah talks about how low he goes. Sperm whales have been documented at 3,000 feet below the surface. So that's my candidate. And I apologize that we had to go down a cryptozoological rabbit hole, or jackalope hole, perhaps we should say. But I appreciate it. From the belly of the beast, Jonah prays to God. And it's interesting, if you look in the Hebrew, the whale or fish, whatever it is mentioned twice. And one time, it's the word is the female form of the word, and one it's the male form of the word. And rabbinical scholars, these Jewish rabbis that just thought a lot about this and studied the word, they came up with kind of an interesting look. Why was this the case? This was their thing. That originally Jonah was in the female of the species and found it uncomfortable. And so God transported him to the male, because obviously that would be a lot more comfortable, right? I think they kind of overcomplicated the matter, perhaps just a little bit. And maybe it's not even that important. But honestly, don't we overcomplicate prayer? Don't we make prayer, like maybe too complicated? I enjoy Christian music, and one of my favorite artists is a guy named Jason Gray. Jason Gray, he's not a really super well-known Christian artist, but he has some songs I really, really enjoy. And he's a fascinating character. He is a stutterer. There's very few interviews with Jason Gray, because when he's talking, he has a really, really, really hard time. But when he's singing, perfect. I just think that's fascinating. But he has a song called Help Me, Thank You. And basically the gist of the song is that there's only really two types of prayers. Help me and thank you. And that, it really doesn't matter. They all go under that, those two big headings. Maybe he oversimplifies it a little bit, because I do think there's a little bit more going on there. You could pray for others, right? That's a different type of prayer. Praying for others is a powerful prayer. You can pray for institutions. You can pray for nations. You can pray for the world. You can pray for, lots of specific things. So, we got to find the middle passage here between the rabbis and Jason Gray. A little bit of both. To me, Jonah's prayer is very specifically a prayer for a person that is kind of at their low point and is crying out to God. A person who has really nothing left. They only have, a cry left. That's all they have. As I was studying this, as I was looking at this over the past couple weeks, I kind of discerned a pattern in it. And that's kind of what I want to look at with you guys today, is this pattern. I even gave it kind of a cutesy title. I say there's 3 phases to this prayer. There's reality, relationship, and release. I even made them kind of rhyme. I thought that was, that sounds very education-ese, right? To make these words like that. We're going to start now with the first verse in chapter 2, and we're going to go chapter 2, 1 through about 5.5. Okay, we're going to go 1 through 5.5. So once again, let me get my spectacles on here, and I will give you that, and then we'll get into it. From inside the fish, Jonah prayed to the Lord his God. He said, "In my distress, I called to the Lord, and he answered me. From the depths of the grave, I called for help, and you listened to my cry. You hurled me into the deep, into the very heart of the seas, and the current swirled about me. All your waves and breakers swept over me. I said, I have been banished from your sight, yet I will look again towards your holy temple. The engulfing waters threatened me. The deep surrounded me. The seaweed was wrapped around my head. To the roots of the mountains I sank down. The earth beneath barred me in forever." When I was about 10 years old, my family went to Florida. It was for my aunt's wedding, and she lived in the Orlando area, and it was an amazing trip. We got to go to Disney World. We got to go to Epcot, which really scratched my nerdy itch right where it was. We got to go to Cape Kennedy, Cape Canaveral, the NASA space, the Kennedy Space Center or something like that. And we got to see all that stuff. And we also got to go to the beach. We got to go to Cocoa Beach, and Cocoa Beach is lovely. I'm sure there are prettier beaches in the world, but this is the first beach that I had ever really been. We've been to California, but the Pacific is always too cold to get in. The Atlantic is cold, but it's a little more warm. So we were able to get in and play and swim and really go deep. And I overestimated my swimming abilities. I somehow thought that swimming in Cleland Pool up above the middle school there somehow qualified me to be a deep-sea diver or something like that. So I just headed out. I got in the water and started going towards Europe or Africa or something like that. And I was doing pretty good for the first 20 feet, 30 feet. And then I started to get in trouble. And I started to lose strength. And, the waves start to go the other way. They start to kind of pull you out. And it's a truly terrifying situation to be in. And I started to go under. And you fight up for a breath, and then you kind of are overwhelmed again by the waves, and you go under. And it's dark and scary. And I probably would not be up here talking to you, which some of you might be like, phew. But I felt a hand grab me and pull me back to shore. It was my dad. My dad swam out there and saved my life. And I've really never been a big fan of the ocean since then. I'll go into my knees, I'll go in, but other than that, I'm like, it's a big, scary, dark, deadly, realm that not really my thing. So I experienced just a slight little bit of what Jonah was experiencing. I mean, he had more. He had all of that and much, much more. And then he was, of course, swallowed by the fish. But I think there's more going on here. In the first 5.5 verses of book 2, I think, he's telling us, physically where he was, but I think he's also telling us kind of mentally and spiritually where he was, the depths, the bottom, the bedrock experience that you can have. And I think this is where we get into this idea of accepting reality, the first R reality. This week, as I was getting my classroom ready, so teachers have a week of prep before kids come, and so I was working in my room, getting things done, and I always like to have something kind of playing in the background to keep my mind, engaged or something like that. And Susan's really good. She puts on K-Love or Air One or something like that. I find some documentary or something like that. I love sports documentaries. And I love the 30 for 30 documentaries, and Disney Plus has a lot of those. So I went on Disney Plus and I found the documentary, let's see here, Doc and Daryl, I think is what's called, Doc and Daryl. And it's about Doc Gooden and Daryl Strawberry. And if you're a baseball fan, especially if you were a baseball fan in the early, mid-'80s, you know those two names. They were two extraordinary talents, generational talents, Hall of Fame type players. Doc Gooden was a pitcher, and if you look at those early, videos of him, hitters are utterly baffled. He could throw many different pitches. He could throw them, devastatingly. Daryl Strawberry was an outfielder with perhaps the sweetest looking swing that you'll ever see. They both were drafted by the New York Mets. They both came up in the early 80s, and they won back-to-back Rookies of the Year awards. And so everybody was like, well, the Mets, the 80s and 90s are going to be the Mets' time. They're going to be a dynasty. And those teams, if you remember them, were stacked. Pitching and hitting and fielding, they were a five-tool team. And they won the World Series in '86, and then that was about it. They kind of were a flash in the pan. And Daryl Strawberry and Doc Gooden both fell to addiction issues. They're young, they're rich, and they're in New York City in the early '80s, mid '80s, and it was just easy to fall into that life. Doc Gooden didn't go to the championship parade, the ticker tape parade in Manhattan the day after they won the World Series because he was strung out on drugs. And both of their careers basically followed a path of they would eke their way back, and then they would fall and eke their way back, and it's just, it was like watching a car wreck from the outside. But the difference between them is, interestingly enough, they're in two very different places right now. Doc Gooden, I shouldn't judge, but he looks like a man that's still maybe using. He's got jerky movements, and he seems like he's hiding stuff. And he his life is centered around basically looking back at the old days. Daryl Strawberry actually runs a camp where it's people that suffer from addiction issues, and they come and he tells them things, and he's a Christian. He's married to a lady who's a former, had addiction issues, and they run this foundation. And they had these two guys, and they sat them down at a table, and you could see the difference between them. Darryl Strawberry looks like a possessed adult human, and Doc Gooden doesn't. And they talked to a guy who had worked with both of them. And the guy said, it all boils down to this. Doc Gooden has never accepted the reality of who he is and what he is like. Where Darryl Strawberry got to the end of himself and accepted that he was an addict and that he needed to do something about it. Doc Gooden still, and even in the interviews, and maybe this is me, adding things, is still kind of evasive and kind of, throwing up excuses and things like that. The difference is admitting reality. When we come before God, job one should always be to accept reality. It's so easy to lie to ourselves. And isn't it funny? You'd think that you'd be the hardest person to lie to in some ways, because you're up here, right? You know the truth, and yet we do it so convincingly. We have uncountable ways of self-talking ourselves into anything, of justifying anything. I deserve this. This is my right to do these things. It's not fair. That's one of my favorite ones. It's not fair, so A, B, C, and D, right? I'm sure that Jonah had convinced himself that what he was doing was right. In not so many words, but that he knew better than God, right? But we don't say those things to ourselves. We justify. We're so good at parsing words. Jonah had to be brought to that place where there is no justification, where there is no self-lying, where there is simply you and God and the truth. We have to come before God and be honest. And I think that's what Jonah's doing here. It's jarring. It's uncomfortable. It's difficult. And it's so necessary. The thing about our fallen, sinful nature is usually we have to be brought to crisis for this to happen. We as a species need to be at the bitter end before we do these things. And that's where Jonah is. He's in the belly of the beast. If you have something coming between you and God, do something about it today. I have many things that I deny are idols, but are absolutely idols in my life. And if I'm honest, I'd say my possessions are one of those. I'd say my emotions are an idol in my life, right? I can justify any emotion, righteous anger, or whatever it is. My covetous nature, I see things and I want them. I look at things online like ads for vehicles, and and I'm like, I don't need it. I don't need it, and yet I want it, and I'm able to somehow talk myself into it. Brothers and sisters, job one is to admit the reality of who we are in front of God. We're sinners. We're sinners, and we have no justification for what we do. So let's move on to the second R. The second R is relationship. And we're going to go to just a couple verses here, 2.5 verses in Jonah 2. We're going to go through 5.5 through 8. 5.5 through 8. But you brought my life up from the pit, O Lord my God. When my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord, and my prayer rose to you, to your holy temple. There's a natural order to things in the universe, isn't there? We as humans seem to want hierarchy. Think about every organization you've ever been in. There's always bosses, and there's always people that are not bosses. Think about the friend groups and informal groups that you've been in your entire lives. There's always kind of a pecking order, right? We seem to crave that sort of hierarchy. Look at animals. Animals are the exact same way. I grew up around animals, cows, horses, sheep, dogs. All of them, without exception, have some sort of hierarchy that they have to establish. The one that jumps to my mind are bulls. If you've ever been around like more than one bull in the same field, you know it can get spicy out there. They fight. One time we got some bulls, and I think we got like 4 bulls, and they were all black, and they were I can't remember, we got them from somewhere else like Wyoming or something like that, high-powered bulls, and we put them together, and the little tiny runt would never accept his place in the hierarchy. He was like little man's disease. He was like strutting, wherever he walked. And he picked fights with these big bulls, and fights and fights and fights, until they almost killed him, like literally almost killed him. He had a broken leg. He looked like he'd been in a car wreck. And so we had the gracious task of getting him and hauling him into a trailer, and he was a fighting bull, and hauling him off of Grand Mesa and being very happy that he was going to be turned into a lean cuisine meal or two when the whole thing was done. Look at horses. You got to be super careful when you introduce horses to each other because they have to establish a pecking order. You can't just throw them together like willy-nilly, or else you might have trouble. Dogs, look at dogs. When they first meet each other, there's like a process that they go through to see who's literally top dog, right? I'm a history guy. You guys know this. I've talked about history before. I love history. And history, to a certain extent, is a story of who's going to be in charge and who's not going to be in charge. But what's weird is the number one most important hierarchical relationship we have in our lives, we go rogue. We go rogue, and that's our relationship with God. We don't want to acknowledge the fact that God is in charge and in control. We don't want to admit the fact that there's a proper relationship with God. And the proper relationship is He's in charge and we take orders. It kind of almost goes back, it kind of bleeds in from the the reality part that I was talking about before. We justify it. We talk about it. It's self-talk. We can talk ourselves into anything. If we're dishonest, then it's difficult to live a proper relationship to God. I'm only really intermittently successful at this. The second part of the prayer, I think, speaks to this. We need to acknowledge the sovereignty of God to correctly pray to Him. And yet look how rebellious we and Jonah are. We'll do anything to keep ourselves at the center of our lives and put God at the periphery. The crazy thing is, once you do the right thing and put God at the center of your life, it feels right. It feels good. Jonah had to be brought to the very lowest spot in his life, figuratively and really, to see this relationship properly. I suppose that's a universal human characteristic. I can look back at my own life and see the times when I was pressed the hardest, when I was, at the least, that's the times where I'm the most eager, the most willing to accept God as sovereign. Finally, let's go to Jonah 2:9. 2:9. 2:9 is where we're going to talk about release. So Jonah 2:9 tells us, "But I, with a song of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will make good. Salvation comes from the Lord." So every single type of business in the world has, like a lingo, a nomenclature, a language that they have in common, right? And a huge part of becoming like on the inside, in the in-group of whatever it is that you do, is learning that nomenclature, learning how to talk like a fill-in-the-blank. I'm a teacher, and we absolutely have our own nomenclature, right? We, my wife and I can, talk education ease, and and nobody else knows. The non-teachers don't know what we're talking about. A few years ago, I was at a training, and this trainer, and I don't even remember who it was, used this phrase: "Surrender the outcome." Surrender the outcome, and that kind of lodged deeply within me. I thought that's an interesting thing to think about. Surrender the outcome. I teach AP World History. I don't know if you're familiar with the AP world, but in the AP world, we kind of work for 9 months for 4 hours, to take a test for 4 hours. We work from August until May, and everything is just kind of aimed towards that 4-hour spot in May. And it's difficult as a teacher because, number one, I don't get to even know what's on the test beforehand. I kind of do, in the sense that I know the standards and I know the like what's basically going to be on there. But I don't even get to be in the room when they're taking the test. There's been a couple times I've taken the day off because it's hard for me to even be around knowing that they're down there. And we've formed this community and we've learned together and we've had laughs and we've done all this, like these cool projects and I'm not there at the end. And I don't get to grade it either. I mean, even if I volunteered to be a grader at the national level, they make sure that you don't get your own students' tests. So you have no power over like that 4-hour period in their life and what happens afterwards. And that's hard. That's really, really difficult. A couple years ago, I had tons of qualifying scores. I thought, I got it. I know how to teach this class. Last year, not so much. I had very few qualifying scores. And I'm back to the drawing board today. The frustrating part is I feel kind of like buffeted at the winds of that. As a teacher, as a control freak, that's really hard. We want to be in charge of the whole process from A to Z. We just have to let go. We just have to release. As a Christ follower that is at the final step of this prayer, we have to release. And I know an AP test in an AP class is a pretty stupid, let's face it, example here. There's lots of things in our lives that we have no control over, that we have to try to release. I think about the illness of a family member. Man, I mean, when my niece was 6 months old, she was in Children's Hospital, and we had no power over what was happening. I gave blood. That was all I could do. When my father was sick, I had no power over it. I had to just release. When my wife had cancer, I was at the mercy of that disease, it felt like. Not as much as, obviously, the person suffering it, but the only thing we can do is release. What about a prodigal child? What about a prodigal family member? Somebody that has just gone a path that you can't really follow, that you can't approve of, that you know in your heart is not right for them. What can you do, right? You kidnap them, bring them home. You got to release. You got to let go. And that is so hard. What about broken relationships? What about like where words have been said that are very, very difficult to take back? And you've done everything that you can do. You've tried everything that you can do, and you just have to let go. What about financial problems? It's like, I've done everything I can do. I've tried really hard. I've worked overtime, and I've worked my money, and I've done. You got to let go. You've got to let go. Work problems. Somebody you don't get along with, or somebody that that doesn't seem to share your vision for whatever it is you're working about, working with, working to. You have to just let go. Jonah prayed from the belly of the beast, which I think this is the key to the whole prayer. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Salvation belongs to the Lord. He has ownership of it. The release is we let go. We surrender the results to God. We acknowledge that we're not God and that He is, and we put our faith in Him. And here's the other really hard part of this one, and I don't have any answers on this one for you guys. What if the outcome is not what you want? What if the outcome is, the illness takes the family member? My father-in-law died last January, and it was heartbreaking, and it's still heartbreaking to this day. What about the, prodigal child that doesn't come home? What about the broken relationship? We just have to let go. We have to let go. And I know that this is easy for me to say. It's easy for me to stand up here and talk to you. But all we can do is trust God. All we can do is know in our heart of hearts that what he is bringing forth is good, is just, and is final. And I don't know how heaven works, but I wonder if on the other side we'll be able to see, oh, I get it now. I understand what was happening. But this side of heaven, all we have is the release. So where does that leave us? Where does that leave us? It leaves us on the beach, right? It leaves us barfed up out of the belly of a whale, covered in God knows what. And you just know, too, I don't know, this is my feeling. I bet, the end of my story here is that God says to the whale, go barf Jonah up on the beach and let him go his merry way. That's us on the beach. And then we have the power to do the next step. And as I call the band back up here, I'm going to start wrapping up, and we're just going to talk a little bit about the next step. I just feel like God probably didn't put him in like a populated place either. It was the middle of nowhere. And he was just standing there, and his clothes were in rags, and he was, the sun was so bright because he'd been in the belly of a whale for 3 days and 3 nights. And he was okay. He was right with God because he had established the reality of the situation, that he was a sinner, that he was at the very depths of his life and spirit and soul. And then he had made the right relationship with God. He had acknowledged that God was sovereign and that he wasn't. And, of course, he had released. He had said, salvation belongs to the Lord, not me. And there he was on the beach. And there we are on the beach, everybody. We're on the beach, and the next steps are under our control. Are we going to walk to Nineveh and try and save people? Jonah probably could have justified going home, taking a shower, change of clothes, I don't know. But I just have this feeling that he started walking directly to Nineveh because that was what the right thing to do was. And that's where we are. Will you pray with me? Father God, we thank you. We thank you for just how much you love us, how much you pursue us. We thank you for the ways that you give us to meet you where you are, Lord. We thank you for the whales and fish in our lives that take us where you want us to be, Lord. And we acknowledge that we're sinners. We acknowledge that we're fallen. We acknowledge that you are God and we are not. We acknowledge that your plan is good and final, and we know that salvation belongs to you, Lord. And as we go, as we worship the rest of this hour, we just pray, Lord, that you would inhabit us with a spirit that would have us walking to Nineveh. In Jesus' name, amen.